So, Ranger Reject, which is one of the few series I'm experiencing week to week, recently finished up what I consider their first major saga. Bailong's Nest went from chapter 13 all the way to chapter 50, and this massive saga, which is by far the longest stretch of story Neji Haruba has ever produced, this is like 5 times longer than the longest arc in quintessential quintuplets, but it can be split up into 2 different arcs at least, with D getting to know the cadets and know Bailong's Nest, and then the exams, which are very much its own arc, and even that can be split up into like 4 or 5 different sub arcs. This will have spoilers for the first 12 chapters of Ranger Reject because it's important to lay everything out in order to give more summarized thoughts on the 38 or so chapters that followed. And there will be some minor spoilers for the Bailong's Nest saga, but I'll try not to get too deep down the rabbit hole and give more general thoughts because this is a series that not a whole lot of people are reading. It's not like One Piece or My Hero Academia. It's good. It's been doing well enough to validate its own existence and to get a Western release with Go Go Loser Rangers, which I've talked about before. But it's not doing well enough to where it can just go with no introduction. If you need a concise summary of what the series is about and what the general appeal is, I recommend my video titled Don't Reject, Ranger Reject, where I talk about, I think it was like the first 10 chapters, or I gave brief thoughts on the first 10 chapters of this series, as well as its initial premise. So, I count the first arc as being like the first 6 chapters leading up to D getting exploded. D is the main character, he's a foot soldier. So he exploded at the end of the first arc, and then the whole second arc is him and one of the main supporting characters, Hibiki Sakurama, kind of conspiring together to get a leg up on the Rangers and get D into Bailong's Nest, which is the Ranger Academy in this world. At the end of that fight, D and Sakurama switched places. D disguises himself as Sakurama and is living as Sakurama in Bailong's Nest, and Sakurama has since disappeared and hasn't been seen since, and I'm really looking forward to his return in the series. It's one of my most anticipated things in the story. From there, it's kind of typical of this kind of dynamic. It's kind of Chunin exams-ish. Actually, not just ish. It really reminded me of the Chunin exams with how there's a goal, but there's a lot of subterfuge and secrets and escalations and complications to that goal. It's not just a straightforward tournament or a straightforward fight. And this is one of the things I'm really liking about this series. You have D, who is a villain. He is a proud villain. He is completely high on his own narcissism when it comes to just being a clever, devious little bastard. And he thinks the Rangers are all like goody two-shoes, or that all humans are, these good guys that will always do. Even though he's been enslaved by the Rangers for the last 12 years, he just thinks that's what good guys do to help keep the peace or whatever. He doesn't want to take the Rangers down a peg because the Rangers suck. He wants to take the Rangers down a peg because they embarrassed him for 12 years. It's much more personal. And throughout this arc, he realizes that people are kind of scummy and that even the good guys are willing to do some shady shit to get what they want. That's gonna be a tough sell for people. There's a lot of characters introduced in this saga, and they all have really cool designs, and it reminded me a little bit of Bleach, particularly the Soul Society arc, where it introduces a lot of characters all at once, but then lets the more relevant characters slowly rise to the top, and slowly over the course of the, 40 or 50 chapter, however long the Soul Society arc lasted, slowly give everyone something to do, some more important than others, and then that allows for characters who didn't have as big of a role in that arc to have much bigger roles later down the line. Komamura comes to mind. That's how I thought this was going to go. I thought there was going to be like 2 or 3 of these other cadets that were going to be super relevant. They ended up becoming very relevant a lot quicker than I thought, and that might be to its detriment. I'm not quite sold on how it handled this, though it did prove that it is not scared to kill off characters. That's one of the minor spoilers. I'm not going to say who, I'm not going to say how, I'm not going to say when, but one of these cadets, at least one of these cadets, does not make it out of this arc alive. But it really shows how good Neji's character work is that he did eventually make me care about all of them. There are shows with much smaller casts that can't achieve that in far longer stretches of time. And I also feel like as far as their designs go, he's maybe a little overcompensating for some of the bad faith criticisms that were thrown around Quince. Because I've seen people be like, how could you like Quince? It's a harem where all 5 girls look the same. Like, it's not their... I mean, yes, they are all attractive. Yes, they do all look identical, but that's part of the point. And also, that adds to the mystery, and the mystery aspect was one of the cooler, engaging, more unique aspects to Quince. And also, it did a lot to highlight just how different the personalities are. Like, he does a lot with a little in Quince, and he does a lot with a lot in Ranger Reject. Still not better than Quince, though, as far as the character writing goes. Give it time. This is much more shonen. This is much more action-heavy. Quince was a rom-com and therefore was very romance and comedy-heavy. This is a black comedy and also an action comedy, so there's a lot of action, and that's actually probably my biggest criticism with this saga, is that he's not that good at action. You can really tell that he's not comfortable with the gesture work to make action panels flow. And that might just be because the other major series I'm reading is One Piece, and Oda is basically a demigod when it comes to drawing action and gesture work, especially with what he's doing in Wano right now. That's a whole nother video right there. Devil Fruit Awakenings are crazy. So for this whole saga, and I imagine the rest of the series, D is walking along this tightrope where he has to stay undercover, but he also wants to stay true to himself, otherwise it's no different than what he was doing before, just being a slave to the powers that be. He also has a question like, what would Hibiki Sakurama do in these situations? Because he is acting as Hibiki, and all of these cadets have prior knowledge and experience with Hibiki, and will get suspicious if he acts too far out of character. One of the major characters introduced in this arc is Sasera Sakurama, Hibiki's older sister, who is also a dragon keeper, one of the 5 dragon keepers that run the Rangers. She is also obsessed with her little brother, and her finding out what happened to Sakurama and finding out what Sakurama did to himself to help this invader is one of those ticking time bombs that is just going to get really messy whenever that factors into the plot again. As for that plot, things get much more complicated because another invader is introduced, X's. We find out that the executives aren't actually completely wiped out, which just further highlights that the Rangers are still necessary, because we were led to believe in the first arc that the Rangers are enslaving the invaders in order to keep up appearances, in order to stay in control of this world. Turns out that the farce is just another layer of the farce, because the executives are alive. They weren't wiped out. They just straight up abandoned their foot soldiers for self-preservation reasons, which gets under D's skin because, again, the 12 years of humiliation he had to suffer at the Ranger's boots. And that really comes to a head. This is a really important arc in D's development, not just because a lot of stuff happens and a lot of stuff that is going to forever change the series happens. Try not to get too far into spoilers, but because it straight up challenges D's convictions, and it makes him have to reaffirm those convictions and make those convictions even stronger than they were before, because now it's not just the Rangers that are on his hit list. Now he has a ever-growing list of people responsible for his humiliation. I love how this arc ultimately ends on that note. Again, I'm trying not to get too far into spoilers. Other than the action, which could use some touch-ups and could just use more practice. I think Neji Hiruba just needs more practice. He needs to look at more successful shonen stories like One Piece, Naruto, My Hero Academia, I'd even go Demon Slayer maybe, and kind of take notes on those. Other than that, the art is incredible. I want a collage of every time D transforms. And the powers are really creative. They're fewer and far between, and we don't have a firm grasp on what everyone can do yet, but the promises are there. We get a lot of Blue Squadron. We get to see, I believe, all of Blue Keeper's abilities. And if all the Dragon Keepers are as creative as he is, that's going to be some visual eye candy right there. I'm really looking forward to the next arc. As far as those side characters go, there's a lot of them. So we have, just as a major roundup of the characters, we have the 5 Dragon Keepers. We have their 5 lieutenants. They have other officers underneath them, but for the purposes of this video, I'm only going to count the 5 lieutenants that actually participate in the Bailong's Nest exams. Then you have the 5 elite cadets, the ones who get picked for the quote-unquote elite team for the second day of the exams. And then you have the 5 quote-unquote rejects. And then outside of that, that's already 5, 10, 15, that's already 20 people. Then you also have X's and Peltrola, who are relevant in this arc. There's not a single character I dislike, but my favorites of this arc were absolutely Ranmaru and Kai Shion. So yeah, 50 plus chapters and Ranger Reject still continues to entertain. I'm still reading week to week. I'm still hooked. I'm looking forward to the next arc. Apparently it's going to be much more of a detective story this time around, and that's actually what I wanted Neji Hiruba's sophomore outing to be, because I really like the mystery aspects of Quince, and there were rumors that Neji's sophomore outing was going to be a straight-up detective story, and then it was only later announced that it was going to be Ranger Reject. Numerical score, the Bailong's Nest, I'd give an 8 out of 10. It was thoroughly engaging all the way through, but it might have ran a little too long. And, like I said, the action wasn't on point all the time. It got pretty sloppy there. Anything else, I would have to go actually, like, beat for beat, character for character. And, yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing more of what these characters can do. I'm looking forward to talking about it more. That about does it. I'm Mediocrity4, and I'll catch you next time.